Are you tired of seeing those who challenge the narrative censored and silenced by mainstream media and big tech? Do you want to know how we can actually move beyond the censorship, beyond the challenges that we've seen over the last couple of years, and really start to truly build a free and open society? Well, then we have just the conversation for you coming up this evening. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. David Thunder, a renowned researcher and lecturer of political philosophy at the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain. He's on a mission to help rebuild free societies. He's a third-time guest on our show. It's delighted to have David back with us, and we'll be talking about the real foundations of a free society and why culture and values are so crucial to preserving our freedoms. But that's not all for tonight. We will also look at the inadequacies of the legal constitutions, the dangers of technocracy, and the importance of civic responsibility in preserving our freedoms. It's time to take back control, and David has some really important insights that can really help us understand the situation that we find ourselves in. Welcome to the Elevate podcast, David.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here. An honor.
Yes, we could joke that it's kind of Dad's club tonight. Both of us have been looking after our kids in the build-up to the recording of this episode. Exactly. Real life goes on despite all of the craziness outside.
Yes, indeed. Real life goes on. That's one of the big lessons I've learned. No matter what you do, the world just keeps moving.
It does. And certainly for myself, one of the greatest motivators, in fact, the work that I'm doing right now is for my son's future. I wish for him to grow up in a world where he has more opportunities and more freedoms than I do, certainly not less. And what it feels like at the moment is we are in unique times, as we know, through what we've witnessed during the COVID chapter, where our liberties, our rights and freedoms have eroded. But it's not just the practical nature of some of the lockdowns and all the other things where we had physical impositions on our freedoms, but it feels like the culture has shifted, David. What's your interpretation of what's happened to freedom within our culture?
My interpretation is that basically there was a latent weakness in the civic culture because these things don't normally happen overnight. I think our civic culture, this is a retrospective kind of judgment because it wasn't so clear to me. I was a bit more gung-ho about democracy perhaps in 2019. I knew that it had its problems, but I was quietly optimistic that things would just chug along. And then when all of the pandemic measures were introduced and people were put under house arrest and these kind of stuff, their constitutional rights were just overturned in an instant, and people just seemed to be demanding more. And there was the opinion polls showed that people were quite happy, and in fact were worried that the lockdowns weren't harsh enough. So that made me think that that while externally or symptomatically there was very clearly a shift, a very visible shift in public attitudes towards restrictions on their freedoms, namely a very high tolerance for restrictions of their freedoms. I don't think that shift would have happened so quickly if there hadn't been an underlying weakness in the civic culture that made it vulnerable. And I suppose we could talk a bit about that, but as a starting point, I might say that citizenship has two dimensions. One is passive and one is active. The passive dimension is that we have rights, and those rights, we have legal rights and political rights. And we don't have to necessarily do anything to deserve those rights. Those rights are conferred on us just by virtue of being a citizen, being a juridical or legal citizen. And then besides the passive aspect, then there's the active aspect, which is basically our ability to participate and contribute to our public institutions and to contribute to the maintenance of democracy. And I would say that let's say citizenship became heavily weighted towards the passive. And I think in many ways, citizens took a backseat and just started to assume that their rights would be granted to them by the state and by state actors, and that they could just devote themselves to their private endeavours, such as industry and business and leisure, and then leave the rest up to our political elites. So I mean, you could say in some ways modern democracy is premised on a division of labour where you have an elite that is sort of legitimated or validated by a public vote, and then we get on with our private life. To some extent, that's actually how democracy works. But I think that over time, we've become more narrower in our perception of public, and our own, let's say, attitude towards the public and our participation has become more minimalist, and perhaps compared with earlier times of democracy, I think that we've become more consumerist and perhaps more complacent. And again, I say this is somewhat of a retrospective kind of theory about what might have happened or what might explain how we swung so dramatically towards renouncing our freedoms in 2020.
Yeah, do you think some of that complacency and some of the other factors you've laid out there point towards some of the vulnerabilities in our society when it comes to the culture as we know it? Because it feels like we almost took the idea of democracy and freedom for granted. We could dispute till the high hills what level of freedom and democracy we've ever had, but compare 2023 or the midst of 2020 with the prior year, 2019, I think we'd clearly see that there was an erosion. So I'm kind of trying to understand where the cracks emerged in your view.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I still puzzle about this, and it's not. I know that Matthias Desmet has one explanation of how this might have happened. I think it has a lot to do with the predominance of emotional sensibilities or sensitivities. So I think our culture has become a very emotional culture. And I think in many ways, rationality and rational discourse has a very limited place in the public square of modern democracies. Ostensibly, of course, we say of course, reason is present in the public square, and you get people like journalists who are, using arguments. And so you would think that, well, these are rational arguments and there's some kind of rational discourse going on. But if you actually scratch under the surface, a lot of that rational discourse is actually a very intense appeal to people's emotions. And it's not that I think that I'm a purist and I think that we shouldn't ever appeal to emotions. Of course, we have to, as Aristotle in the Rhetoric says, all argumentation is emotional in some ways, right? Emotionally charged. Of course it is. But what has happened is that our culture has become so saturated with emotion that a lot of our public argumentation is pushing buttons. It's basically pressing emotional buttons. And let's say, what emotions am I talking about? Well, for example, the emotion of compassion clearly this is before the pandemic, all of the debates, whenever there's a debate about rights, for example, there's usually a group that's considered as a victim group that is reclaiming its rights, and the argument for them getting rights is usually that it would be cruel not to grant them this particular right or ability or opportunity, and so that kind of language of cruelty and compassion and solidarity just became very dominant. And I actually think if you analysed a lot of the major issues, including quite revolutionary changes in our moral culture, you would see that behind those changes very often is the language of compassion and solidarity. And not that compassion is a bad thing itself, but it can be easily abused and manipulated. And whether it be, as an example that's kind of controversial these days, let's take the transgender issue. So when people say that we should recognize people who have decided to opt to be a man or a woman, then it's considered cruel not to recognize that new identity. And in many ways, I think when you try to then talk about the idea of biology, it's overridden by the language of compassion and inclusion. And so anytime you try to reference an objective reality, a mind-independent reality, the emotion of compassion just seems to just sweep in, and all scientific discourse goes out the window. And of course, in the pandemic, we saw that the emotion that was being tapped into was fear, as well as compassion, by the way. The two emotions were being used. So, the fear of death, the fear of our own death and our own disease, fear for our loved ones. This was ramped up, deliberately ramped up, as we now know. So Matthias Desmet, as I know you've talked to him on your program, he thinks that there was a kind of, if you want, a collective psychosis where people were just carried along in a kind of non-rational, sub-rational way with this fear and insecurity and a desire for stability and security and certainty, and that they were dealing with their own anxieties, but then they found a collective way to deal with their anxiety. And I think, or free floating anxiety,
yes,
or something like that, that's hard to pin down. And so the public narrative, like there's a certain narrative that emerges that provides an answer to that anxiety. And what it does is it provides a source, first of all. It gives a name to the anxiety, which is COVID. And then it gives an answer to the anxiety, which is basically just, social distancing, in the most radical form possible. And then that makes people feel calm. I think there's a lot of truth to that explanation. But I think in the long run, you have to look also at long run developments and ask whether we were primed for emotional manipulation in a way by the market, the consumerist market, which also constantly manipulates emotions, but also politics, which really PR specialists are constantly finding ways to tap into people's emotions. So I think the salience of emotion and emotional manipulation in a way trains us and primes us to be more sensitive to these kind of stimuli.
Thanks, David. It's a really interesting foundation and context for where I'd like to take the conversation next, really about more of a forward-facing conversation around building a free and open society once again, and in doing so, exploring the role of culture. We've kind of touched upon the cultural elements in terms of the vulnerabilities within the culture and how it's manifested over the last couple of years. I'd like to explore how culture could become a foundation, or should become a foundation, of a free society move forward, and also explore that in contrast to legal mechanisms. So could you provide your views on what role culture plays or could play in a free society moving forward? Yeah.
Let me just step back first and just mention that when we say culture, what I understand by culture is basically people's habitual attitudes, or if you want, their worldview, and how that worldview shapes both their perception of reality, but also their behavior is shaped by a certain set of attitudes, also social norms. And so culture unites people in a way, you could say, because it's a shared horizon of value, meaning, and norms that makes our social world navigable and intelligible to us. And so it's important to point out that culture is more foundational than institutions, at least in my view, and in the view of some great thinkers such as Alexis de Tocqueville, the French thinker from the 19th century. And law is derivative from culture, even though it can influence culture. It builds on a culture of freedom and a culture of democracy. And the law would be useless without that underlying culture. It would just be a hollow shell. So culture is important for freedom in the sense that culture basically gives us a set of social and moral conventions that can guide us and is not easily subject to, let's say, change by fiat, by legislative fiat. So if those conventions are solid and if they are internalized in people's way of life, then it's not easy for a legislator to come along and just say, you know what, I'm going to abrogate this convention and that convention because I don't like it. I was discussing this with colleagues the other day about the convention surrounding greeting, how we greet each other. In some cultures, men and women greet each other with 2 kisses. In other cultures, it's with 1 kiss. In other cultures, it's probably just with a nod. In some cooler cultures, and so, could you imagine if tomorrow a legislator said, "From now on, you're going to greet each other with a thumbs up"? That's the new convention. People would laugh in their face. And they wouldn't. I don't think they do it. I don't think they do it because
you say that, David. People were elbow bumping during the pandemic.
Well, that's true. So, I mean, fair enough. That's a good point. But that wasn't stipulated directly by law. I mean, cool. I don't think that. So that was a kind of more. It was more of a social change in attitudes that came through media and through public discourse. But I think Justice Sumption, former UK Supreme Court Justice, he talked a lot about conventions, and he mentioned that when you break a convention, a legal convention, or even a social convention that's important for freedom, that you break the spell, and it can be more difficult then to restore that convention. But I've thought a lot about the role of parliaments, and one of the breaks on parliamentary, let's say, tyranny, without a doubt, is convention. And by this, I simply mean shared norms, social norms that are recognized and that are viewed as legitimate by people. That gives them a kind of independent criterion that cannot be simply abrogated or destroyed by the will of a legislator. And then we could talk about, okay, how do people understand these conventions? Because it's true that if somebody thought that conventions were completely arbitrary and they thought, oh, well, it's convenient to have some coordinating mechanism, so we have a convention, but it really doesn't have any moral basis. If they don't have a moral conviction that the convention is right, then it's much easier for legislators to come along and say, to overturn the convention. So it also has a lot to do with our actual moral framework, our view of morality and what is right and wrong, what is true and what is false. So maybe an example would be property rights. Imagine if people just lost their conviction that property was important. I mean, if people lost that conviction, then the conventions become totally arbitrary that protect property. And at that point, then people go along with conventions out of drift and out of kind of just, well, it's there, I might as well go along for convenience. But when a legislator comes along and says, yeah, we need to redistribute the property because that way we can get more to the poor, then that person who has no moral conviction about that convention might just go along with it. So your personal ethical commitments of each citizen will make a big difference to how these conventions function in practice.
Yeah, and this is where I suppose become most concerned, even talking about property rights. The last 2 years has made me realize how fragile some of these conventions and norms can be under certain conditions. But then the long tail of that, the extended problems that occur from that, I think it's an intricate equation. We've talked about the World Economic Forum on this podcast a number of times, but the idea that you'll own nothing and be happy, and okay, it's a social analysis, it's a commentator, it's not like the official view of the World Economic Forum, but underneath it is a principle. And you could argue, you could strip it back and say, well, we used to own CDs and now we have Spotify accounts, we effectively rent the music and da-da-da. But it to me sounds like a cultural convention that could emerge from a downstream from the kind of established culture that's kind of made its way within the midst of our classical liberal culture to now be something entirely different. So, and I agree with you that the kind of legal frameworks and politics are both downstream from culture. But I suppose my concern now with the nature of our current culture and its fragile state and vulnerable state is that it could quite frankly go either way. And I've been toying with so many different ideas around how we begin to build a free culture again. And even looking back to my childhood in the 80s and 90s and thinking about the types of movies that I watched, the kind of what was on television at the time, who the role models were in celebrity culture. And it's changed so dramatically. I almost remember seeing, it was all American, all the television was always Americanized, but there was this, fierce independence, the cowboy, the courageous victor. And I'm not saying there aren't problems with some of those role models, certainly upon, men and how they view how they're supposed to show up in life. But in many ways, some of those almost free-spirited, courageous elements that play into the value of liberty appear to have dwindled or disappeared. And I'm curious where we begin now, and if we are to learn from some of the mistakes, and I'll hand it back to you again now, David, if we are to learn from perhaps some of the things where, because, it'd be easy to look back with rose-tinted spectacles and be like, oh yeah, 80s, 90s, groovy. It's all good. It feels all good compared to now, but let's be honest, there's plenty of today's problems resulted from further downstream. So I ponder on how do we form a healthy culture of freedom moving forward? How do things need to shift? It feels like a counterculture movement is required.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think for the time being, the majority has lost its understanding of freedom, or at least its understanding of freedom has become degraded. And so I don't buy the idea that it was just a little blip, or that it was a temporary collective psychosis or something like that just is going to just blow away. I think that, and that's why the psychosis explanation only goes so far, because as a temporary phenomenon, maybe it could explain how things got so extreme, maybe to some extent, but there's a wider social development that is more stable, unfortunately. That I think there in some ways the first thing we have to do is those of us who still really value freedom from tyranny, and also the freedom to shape our lives and our communities, we have to begin with a sense of realism. And that means we have to accept that we're no longer in the majority. If we ever were, we're not in the majority. And therefore, we shouldn't be looking forward to crushing political victories in which we have sweeping landslide majorities, that are just celebrating freedom. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. And if it did, it would be more likely to happen because of a Trump-esque kind of phenomenon of just shallow populism that manages to manipulate people and, press the right buttons. And that's not what I call a revolution, a cultural revolution that I am particularly happy about or happy to be part of necessarily. So that's the first thing, to recognize, that we're not necessarily in a mainstream majority position. And then from there, it's important to recognize it simply so we don't suddenly get scandalized when we realize that we're in a minority, in case we didn't realize that before. And then the other thing is, I'm sure most people realize this already, but some people are hanging on to this idea that we'll, somehow build a coalition and that we'll have like some kind of a version of Meloni will come along, and the Italian prime minister, another populist, who will just sweep people along on, into a libertarian position or something. I think that's just fairyland kind of stuff, But
well,
I do think
I certainly agree. In the short term, it's fairyland. I think what we're witnessing now is 50, 60 years of coalition building.
So that's true. Good point. So in the long run, I don't want to rule out that in the long run that things might become more favorable, but the trend is not right now is not very favorable. And I'm not saying that I'm a determinist and that things have to go one direction, but I think that this will be. I mean, if I was a gambling man, which I'm not really, but if I was a gambling man, I would bet that we will be in an embattled minority position for at least a few more generations. That's kind of how I would see it. But other people may take a different view of it. But what I was going to say about the change and how we might bring about that change, I think basically role models are really critical, because when people think about how society is guided or coordinated, they often think of the law as a very easy, quick, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people. But then the thing that doesn't always come to mind is role models. And role models are actually extremely fundamental for how we orient ourselves, how we decide how to act. And this happens from the time we get up. I mean, really, our whole life, in many ways, we look to role models, whether we're adults or children. If someone's working and they're not a completely free, I mean, let's say someone is working in a team and they have a boss or they have management over them, they look to upper management to see what the ethos of the company is and see what's acceptable and not accepted behavior. What kinds of expenses can I claim? Can I claim expenses for a limousine, or should I be claiming for just a regular economy kind of car rental? As a trivial example, I'm just giving you the trivial example, but we look to these people to see, and this is actually, in studies, in in-depth interviews with former MBA, Masters in Business students, they found, interestingly enough, that they looked to upper management and middle management, depending on their own position. They looked upwards in the scale, in the hierarchy, to orient themselves and figure out what the ethos of the company is and to be inspired. And unfortunately, they found that they were not inspired because they saw that there was rot up at the top, and these were all major companies. So that's in an economic context or a business context. But if you're, if you're in a school or a university, or you're in your neighborhood or in your family, and your extended family, you don't escape role models, basically. So some role models are very up close. They're just, literally physically in your space. And you're sort of interacting with them, rubbing shoulders with them on a day-to-day basis. Some of them are really terrible role models, and some of them are good role models. And then others are not up-close role models. They're actually more what I'd call, let's say, cultural role models that, in a way, influence a lot of people and communities. And they're basically, I mean, I would have to say journalists. are a form of role model, really, because for better or for worse, because they model how to reason about public life for citizens. And politicians also, for better or for worse, are role models. So podcasters have a certain role model function as well. So where I'm going with all of this is to put it to try to sum it up and keep it simple. I would say we have two terrains to work. One is the up close terrain, in which we try to provide leadership and inspirational leadership to the people around us. And the other is the culture, the larger scale cultural terrain, which is media, journalism in particular. And there, I think, and art and films and all of that kind of sphere of the public forum, where I think you can have a form of role model that is very influential. And I think while I am a big localist and I do believe in local community being really important, and without that we're screwed, I also think that to make intelligible the larger society and to move through that society, we need also kind of larger models, role models. And the media, I think, if I were to think of one, let's say, outlet or one social actor that plays a role, an important role, it is the media, whether independent media or mainstream media.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction. Well, several distinctions there. Firstly, in terms of the role model and the way it operates, from my time in corporate, when I was in leadership positions, I really felt it. If I was tired, even on a granular level, if I went into the office tired, the energy in the office was lower than it was if I was on form and feeling vibrant. Similarly, even if I was slightly ill, like the beginnings of a cold, it feels like everyone else has gone downhill. It was marvelous to see the impact that your state of mind, your physiology, how you carry yourself, how you speak as a leader directly impacts in real time. And I hadn't appreciated it because I originally started in commercial banking. For those who don't know my history, here it all comes. Don't worry. Where I dealt with individual clients. I was face to face with individual businesses. But when I went into the commercial, the retail side of the banking industry, I was leading teams, and that's when I saw the power of leadership and the impact that any individual can have based upon how you show up in the world. And you're absolutely right. Where did I gain my inspiration? My direct line management and the key leaders in the company. And at the time, in the 8 years I was there, we had three distinct top leadership, and one of the three I found really inspiring because of the way they actually shaped the culture, interestingly, of the organization, and the other two less so. And if you take that out into the real world, if you will, you're absolutely right. Those role models are key. But I think it's important that we don't discount ourselves as role models and the impact that we can have on our families, our communities. And I'm with you on the local element. And I was part of a conversation with our members recently, and we were talking that we need to think local, we need to think national, and we need to think international. And I think the same is true of this conversation. But what's interesting on a local level, David, is if I think about, and in fairness, I've just moved to a new area, but for my previous area where I lived for 10 years, if I think about local role models, okay, I can think of a couple of business leaders who've done some pretty impressive things that inspired me. But in the political sphere, none. In the media sphere, none. So I think part of the reason why we don't have local role models is because there's an absence of them. It particularly in fields like politics. There's it would be unfair to any given area to say there's not positive role models in a geographic location. But in the key pillars of society, if you will, in politics, in media, and various other education. And again, individuals, there are plenty of individuals that do things behind the scenes that perhaps we never see. But in the public, the light of the public eye, I think we're coming up short in every way at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think even the word politics, as soon as I hear the word politics, I immediately think corruption, or at best narrow-mindedness and pettiness and careerism. These are the kinds of words that come to mind for me, and selfishness and greed. So unfortunately, politics, I mean, you could say that politics, attracts and probably has always attracted a certain kind of personality, and opportunists tend to be very attracted to politics because they see a way to exert power and a platform for, acquiring and furthering their own interests. And this is just the way politics tends to work. But having said that, there have been great politicians historically. There have been great leaders in politics, and there have been very influential. And there have been people who weren't politicians at all, but simply had an enormous, and I would say, positive influence. Gandhi, I mean, it's not that I'm saying everything about his personal life was wonderful or something like that, in case anyone comes back to me and
it's like talking about culture. Yeah, but did you know this one thing? You're a shill, David. That's but we have to look at the nature of. I'll come to talk about that, because that's a dangerous part of our culture as well. It's like we can no longer say or give examples for fear of being reprimanded because of something that someone did at a different point in history. We're almost aiming for this impossible standard of perfection, of Puritanism again, that like holy level of, impenetrable good. And I just think, where does that expectation come from? Because that's not healthy either.
No, absolutely not. And where it's a good question. I mean, where it comes from. I mean, one aspect has to do with scapegoating, and it's more comfortable to point to the sinner outside of myself, the person who's screwed up, or the person who's a bit of a head case or a disastrous life or whatever, someone who feels like they're just off the rails. The black sheep makes me feel more like a white sheep, if you want to put it that way. So it can be very consoling to just point fingers. But I think regarding politics, I think that we shoot ourselves in the foot, those of us who, spend time criticizing our politicians in some ways, because we don't put ourselves forward for those roles ourselves. So we kind of, there seems to be a tacit kind of a deal where we just say we'll let them take up those roles, those dirty roles, and, we'll stay away from them because they're too messy. And then we complain when those people who took up the roles don't behave the way we'd like them to behave. But there's a bit of a hypocrisy in that, because why are we so happy to just leave the field open for opportunists? And, if you just do a survey, even formally, of, say, students, idealistic students in a university, and ask them, would they see themselves going to politics? I mean, the last time I did that survey, I was surprised that one or two of them actually said yes, they did see themselves going to politics. But that was like, I'd say one or two of maybe 40, 40 or something. So I think we need to keep our minds open to participating in politics, even if it's in your local neighborhood, your city council or your town council. I mean, who wants to go to a town council meeting? Honestly, nobody in their right mind would feel like going to a town council meeting. But if we all just check out and just leave it to whoever, again, we shouldn't complain then when we get the results we get, when the people who are most civic-minded just take a back seat.
I think this is an important point, David, because you're right. It's very easy to point the fingers and blame outside of ourselves. And I know we plan to talk a little bit about the role and dangers of technocracy. But if you look at how this kind of global technocracy has ascended to power, the counterbalance to that is we've seen widespread political apathy, and that's quantifiable. It's quantifiable in the number of people who belong to a political party. If you look in the UK, and again, going to a local council meeting, I'm sure you're right. And again, there might be some that are fun. If anyone's watching this and has been to a fun council meeting, put it in the comments. Maybe I know the ones you'll say were fun, because last year I know people were going into them and doing all kinds of guerrilla activism. They were probably fun, but for the wrong reasons, or for the right reasons at the time, but for the wrong reasons in terms of the nature of this conversation. But the same is true with political parties. You know, I went to behind the scenes at the political hustings in the build up to the leadership election over this last period, and it was just almost embarrassing to watch. But the reality is, if we are going to remove ourselves from the political system altogether without a more attractive or superior alternative ready to go, then we're setting ourselves up to fail. And I've subsequently acted on my own advice and joined, well, a number of political parties, and I just watch now for their emails. I look at their internal communication where there is opportunity to give feedback or submit points of view. I take every opportunity I can. I could go much deeper, of course. There's many other ways that political parties can be influenced, but at least I've scratched the surface. And I think we can point fingers, but our civic responsibility, our civic duty to play our role in holding politicians to account. And I posted the figures just recently. The United Kingdom is spending £600+ billion per year in tax. That's all taxpayer money. And I thought, 600 billion? 600 billion? How is that effectively being spent? You know, and I couldn't get an answer from anyone. You know, I got aggregates. What about all the wasted money in between? You know, I think we're so far removed from the political game that we feel powerless to influence it.
Yeah, I mean, so there's one aspect of my research that I'm kind of a line of research or a line of argument that I'm pursuing, and that is to explore the idea of kind of renaissance in municipalism, like whereas the power of cities, especially small cities and or medium-sized cities and towns, could in some ways start to eat into the power of the state, and maybe take back a little bit of the power that the state has taken from them, right? And so I kind of, I mean, it's a bit of an archaic example, but I don't think it's completely irrelevant. The Hanseatic League is like a league of Germanic cities from, you know, that came into its own around the 14th, 15th century, and lasted for several centuries. And it was basically a league of merchant cities, you know, in around the area where Germany is now, that general area of Northern Europe. And they had strategic interests in common. And so these towns basically sent delegates to one of their, let's say, lead cities to negotiate treaties, to settle disputes, and so on. And they weren't a state. No, a modern person would, theorist or even citizen, would probably want to call them a state, just because that's the knee-jerk reaction. Of course there's a state, because without state there's no order. Everything would collapse. How could there be an order without a state? Calm down. There can be order without a state. Yes, there can. These were cities, independent cities, that coordinated their common life through a kind of council without the apparatus of a state intervening. And so they depended on the agency of the cities to implement their resolutions. But also, in many ways, the consent of the cities given through these let's say, assemblies. So now, this is, of course, going back to a different time. I'm not saying that we could just produce this model. And interestingly, it was also military alliances and defensive alliances. It was very practical issues that they were dealing with. It wasn't pie in the sky stuff. And so one of the exit routes from statism, from my perspective, from the dominant national state that has these gigantic budgets that you were just talking about there, and has limited let's say in the best case scenario, limited accountability for their spending. What's the exit strategy? How do we get to a different kind of institutional arrangement that's more bottom up? One way could be through the leaders of cities basically coming to a realization that they actually have some power, economic power even, and social power. And that if they stand up and they actually kind of give example in their speech of the fact that cities have dignity before the state, and they actually, campaign to increase their own fiscal powers and regulatory powers, that could be a start, a step in the right direction, away from a highly nationalized and centralized state. And I'm just saying that as a kind of a very long-term, maybe speculative line. I'm not saying that people can act on this immediately necessarily, but just to give hope that his history is not just completely predetermined, and the national state will probably dwindle over time. We don't know when or how, but this is one way that it might happen, is that the power of states might increase again.
Yeah, no, that's important.
Sorry, cities, the power of cities.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. It's something I've been looking into as well in this regard, because obviously we've got the local elections coming up in due course, in just over a month's time, about 6 weeks' time, and a lot of us have been thinking about, of course, can we get more freedom-orientated or freedom-minded councillors elected on the local level to begin to influence policy? And whilst I think there is potential for obviously localized representatives who have a certain mindset, because if you've got groupthink within any institution, it's not a healthy outcome. So even on a very micro-cultural level or micro-political level, the ability to get localized representatives who have a different mindset or a different worldview, I think is a useful step. But my research showed me just how little power local government have over national policy, or of course global policy. And that disconnect was the most shocking thing and it's not to say that some of the larger cities, London, Manchester, can't impact national policy, but I just didn't find any tangible evidence that showed me there was a real strong link between local politics and national politics.
Well, they're stripped of powers. They're stripped of their power by the national structures. They make them impotent. So in that way, it's a structural problem. It's fundamentally a structural problem, the way the political system is structured. And so one positive thing that I'd say is that people who have positions of authority locally, they have a platform and they have a voice that is unique. And, in that sense, the mayor of a town or a city may not have an awful lot of political power, strictly speaking, but they have a certain amount of cultural power, because they have a kind of legitimacy in their standing as being somehow representative, even if their actual power is limited. And they claim to speak for the people of the city. And in doing so, they can actually configure and they can shape the public mindset. Yes. And this is one of the important sometimes neglected features of politics, because we think that if they can't, change national politics directly, then they can't do anything. Not quite right. They can actually, in subtle ways, through their speech and their language, they can be an example to citizens of how to be a good citizen, how to think about politics. And even if they say, look, I'm going to be honest with you, we're impotent. We have been cut off from power by the national structures, and this is a problem. We need a rejuvenation of municipalism, a renaissance of municipalism. Even that discourse, even to put that discourse in the public forum, how many city councillors or mayors have the magnanimity to put that kind of discourse in front of people? Well, I haven't done any kind of exhaustive survey, but I would guess that not too many.
Yeah, I mean, even during the height of the pandemic, where when we had localized lockdowns, we did see some resistance, for instance, from some local mayors, where they took a stand and spoke about the nature of the national policies and how it wasn't a reflection of their local environment, and how they've taken pride in the setup to minimize risks and all, et cetera, and therefore shouldn't be subjected to the same policy. But of course, then the machinery came down on those individuals, and funding requests for other things suddenly start getting denied, and people start getting smeared in the press, and it's the self-preservation nature of the system. But I do agree with you fundamentally. I think that's the important thing. I don't want to take this into a bleak place, because you're absolutely right. Again, where we started about culture and role models, having those individuals shifting the culture on a localized basis is in fact part of the solution, because when that starts to happen locality to locality, that's when you start to see swathes of the country shifting. That's where you can see things starting to move. So
think about think about the national state. I mean, think about how national states got created. I mean, a lot of the way they got created partly was through ideology. And so, yes, there were military alliances, and there were military needs and needs for protection, and lots of strategic reasons why national states became so dominant. But internally, how they legitimated their power was through ideology. And so in that way, they had to create, let's say, in the most charitable way, we can call it a public philosophy, right? Because ideology, can be very manipulative. And I believe there was a lot of ideology involved. There was certainly a myth that was told about the people somehow authorizing this national state to act on their behalf, which is a fiction, obviously. I mean, it is a fiction, because nobody ever asked me if I wanted to live in a national state. And certainly people, I might vote for damage limitation exercise. I might vote in national elections, but I'm not endorsing the fact that there's a national state and that the power is concentrated at the top when I go to vote. That's not my intention in any way. But I think the narrative that was woven for us over the centuries, and this is very much has been with us for centuries, is basically that, the sovereign state was a creation of some kind of social contract, and that we bought into it in order to protect our better interests. And that story is quite powerful. It's clearly a powerful story, because it's clearly succeeded at bringing a lot of people along. And I say this as actually a success story in some ways, of the fact that telling stories, weaving the right kind of narrative, is how you bring people along and help them to transfer allegiances or reconsider their allegiances. And so for me, breaking down that narrative and constructing an alternative narrative is one of the fundamental steps. For example, going back to the municipalism issue, helping people identify more strongly with their town or city than with the state. That could be one step in the right direction. Someone might say they're English. Okay, you're English, and you come from wherever, some city or wherever, Liverpool or wherever it is, and realize that your identity and your sense of belonging, actually, in many ways, if you live in Liverpool, may give you a more real sense of belonging than England in some ways. But I think, not that they have to be there's got to be a competition between them, but the way that sense of belonging and identity, then kind of the way power is woven into the narrative. So, nationalism and national patriotism often is used to legitimate a highly centralized national power, as if being an English patriot actually meant endorsing highly concentrated top-down power, right? I mean, if you say it out loud that way, it sounds a little bit absurd.
Yes.
But clearly anyone who dissents from top-down power can be considered as disloyal. And anyone who considers that the current political structure of England, say, is defective and there needs to be a new structure, some people might think they're not English enough because they're questioning the political structures, which I think is frankly ridiculous. But I guess I think that, you know, we need loyal opposition, and you shouldn't have to renounce your citizenship, so to speak, your national citizenship, in order to think about alternatives.
Well, I mean, your latter point, I think, is a really important point that's under-regarded in terms of one of the big barriers to political progress. And if you think about the kind of pomp and rigor of the political process in the UK, I mean, if you watch any amount of parliamentary process, I mean, I literally think back to when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I remember my dad having it on the television. He was always watching the 6 o'clock news, and I would see these grey-haired, grey-suited men pounding their fists and jeering across these green leather benches and saying, "My right honourable gentlemen," and all these different processes that are baked into the political fabric of its existence. And here I am now in my adult life, approaching my 40th year, and it's still the same. We kind of cling on to these traditions, and in the current context of what we're looking at, I'm not going to say negative things about preserving tradition, because we could argue freedom is a tradition that we've started to suffer losing. And I think this is often the battle in the political realm is between conservatism and progressivism. What do we conserve and what do we progress? And we treat them as though they're diametrically opposite and that we should only focus on one or the other. So and a lot of people have found themselves feeling more conservative over the last couple of years because they want to conserve freedom. It's you know, for those who have been on the more liberal left, they say, "Oh, you know, I'm relating more to the right." It's like, well, it's because you are feeling a connection to conserving something, and there's also a rationalism that's required in order to, which is typically, anyway, all those dynamics are playing out. But I do think it becomes a barrier. It becomes a barrier to political transformation because we've got an aging population in the UK and across Europe, and those traditions are highly regarded. So it's how do you preserve the essence of tradition while still making progress towards something that is more suited and suitable for the modern world that we live in if we're going to create political transformation? Because there's so many dynamics, and I've only scratched the surface, and, you know, thinking about how political transformation could occur. And firstly, you know, when I see political groups that are specifically focused on freedom, I think that's a positive thing. But at the same time, as we've talked about, we're in the minority. So expecting to win campaigning on a single policy of freedom is only ever going to get you a certain number of votes, I'm afraid. The closest example I've ever seen of this working is in Denmark with the Alternative. The Alternative was a brand new grassroots political party. They ended up getting somewhere between 10 and 11% of the vote. It is amazing, you know, amazing accomplishment for a new party. But they were focused on green issues primarily. And again, you know, they got that far on the green issue. But where's the rest of the 90%? You can't leave behind everything else. Similarly, when it comes to creating a new political paradigm, we can't just throw the baby out of the bathwater and be like, as much as I personally would love to just simplify things a great deal and completely change the model in which the realm in which politics is unfolded. I mean, just on a side note, I will shut up now, but if you counted up the amount of times that someone says "my right honourable gentleman" or whatever else in these formalities, and you actually timed how many frequency they occur in a day and how much time it takes, I would hate to see the wasted hours, days, months, and years just in formalities alone, and that's our taxpayer money. So it's a long meandering way of thinking about your latter point around these traditions and how do we think about moving forward with something that can actually bring along more people on the basis that we still respect some of those traditions whilst forging a path towards something more effective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of continuity and not trying to, as you say, throw the baby out with the bathwater, not trying to declare a revolution in the style of the French Revolution, off with their head kind of revolution.
Yes.
I don't believe in those kinds of revolutions in general. So I think it's very important that people not misunderstand when somebody wants to a radical renovation or renewal of our political system, because it doesn't actually mean abolishing the parliament or something like that, or parliamentary democracy. It means modifying parliamentary democracy and making it more responsive to the people. And unfortunately, parliamentary democracy has come to be understood. Although, to be fair, in the case of the United Kingdom, in case of British democracy, it's kind of built into it's a doctrinal issue, really, because the whole concept of sovereignty is the king in parliament, the crown in parliament, the king in parliament is sovereign. This idea, which has become modified more recently, but in general, there's a kind of very strong attachment because of the way in which legal and political doctrines have developed in the United Kingdom to the idea that the national parliament is supreme and sovereign over everything that goes on, basically, and that they have the last say. And then that has been equated with order. And so then public order means that the national parliament should have the last say and should be kind of sovereign. And so the challenge is to say, hold on a second, we do need a parliament because we need coordination at the national level. But there's no reason to assume that they should have the last say on every issue or that they should be sovereign over everything that happens in the country. There's such thing as partial sovereignty. There's such thing as partial authority as well. And the idea that in every contest between Parliament and a local organ of government, Parliament has to win every single case is basically a dogma of modern politics. So where I'm getting to really is that if you want to really want a radical change, the best way to do it is to gradually construct a kind of plan B while keeping plan A in place. It's not that you throw out plan A and say, oops, we don't have a plan B. That was a bit of a mistake. It's more like, you sort of question plan A, you change the discourse around plan A, but simultaneously you help people to see that there's actually other ways to do things. And so, I mean, as an example back from, the whole city thing, basically, like, say you have cities who decide to go into partnerships. Okay, so totally voluntary. So you could have twin cities or towns that say in the southeast, they say, we're now the southeast towns. We form a partnership. We coordinate with each other. We form a block to make certain kinds of deals with businesses and so on, a trading block or whatever. Within the limited capacity, they can do that. And that's a way of exemplifying another way of doing things at the intertown and municipal level. And it might even be symbolic to a certain extent, but it shifts the discourse a little bit. And then at the more local level, I'll give you an example from my local area, which is people whose politics wouldn't necessarily resonate with me. because they'd be very much sort of, some of their leaders might be Marxian leftists who are very suspicious of private property, at least based on one of their writings that I had to correct, because it was not correct, but revise because it was going to be representative of the sort of local neighborhood council, if you want. We had a common cause, let's put it that way. The common cause was to stop the municipal council from installing surveillance cameras on our streets. And so with that common cause, we signed a joint declaration, and I had to remove some of the Marxist language from it because I felt it wasn't building a consensus with us. But to their credit, I would say, in spite of my political and philosophical differences with some of their foundational issues, first of all, they were dead on the money as far as I'm concerned regarding the surveillance cameras. They wanted them gone, and I was with them on that. And second, they were quite effective essentially they erected a form of legitimacy that was completely independent from the formal institutions. They just started, announcing that they were going to have neighborhood meetings and bringing people along and meeting every Thursday and somewhere locally at nighttime to discuss issues that people care about. And they basically built a kind of very loose alliance of people who lived in this town and contacted any formal groups in the town as well to kind of bring them on board. And so I was roped into their umbrella, if you want, but willingly and with my eyes open. And they did press conferences. Like, they went in front of the press and they said, we are the such and such collective or association of the neighborhood of this. And they came and they claimed to be a voice for the people of the area. And they were able to get some people to sign on to their declaration to make it more legitimate. And because, of course, my group, our neighborhood association, has no political power to speak of, real political power. But, they're able to say it's a joint declaration. And all of this with zero political power, real political power. And what happened was, ultimately, is that they even ran a petition through the neighborhood. And in the end, the city council, the town council, the municipal council withdrew the whole project. They cancelled the project, in fact, and with the claim that they were afraid that the cameras would be vandalized, which I don't buy for a second. They were really just responding to political pressures. And I loved the example because it really deals with a lot of the objections that people have. Oh, the power structures don't recognize me. Oh, I'm not really given real power by the power structures. Well, hang on a second. The power you have is perception.
Yes. A
lot of your power is perception. And so the moment people think that you are a voice for the people of your area, you have power.
Powerful. David, that is such a powerful example. And so pertinent, really. Because, again, I've been looking at this. I've been asking myself, how do a lot of these centralized organizations come to power? How do they come to legitimacy? How do they come to authority? And there are so many examples of international organizations. Well, let's take the World Economic Forum. I mentioned that. They are a highly influential, if not the most influential group in the world right now. And it started with an idea. One person. Now, I'm not saying I can condone the direction that organization has taken, but as an example of centralized or organizations that have authority, they come from people coming together and assuming authority. Now, there's lots of things we can learn. I've used a potentially negative example there, but we could use a positive example. I was involved in the formation of the Together Declaration, which tackled vaccine passports and vaccine mandates in its early inception. And again, we brought together all manner of activist and political groups who operated independently and under their own banners and with different views and different viewpoints, but we formed an alliance. And again, no no legitimate political power in the sense that it's an electable body, but it was an influential body and still is. And there are plenty of examples. And again, to use your example of different localities partnering together, and again, unfortunately, I've only got examples of ones that have been very effective, but ones that I personally would rally strongly against. But it shows that they can be effective. So you've got the C40 cities, for instance. I don't know if you've come across the C40 cities, but it's a global network of mayors taking action on climate issues. Now, you know, we're not here to dispute the climate science or any of the things that go with that, but the organization is heavily behind these kind of 15-minute cities. And you can see the power that they have outside of governments, because you've got, say, Sadiq Khan in London moving ahead with things like ULEZ schemes and 15-minute cities in London, when the political regime is currently in opposition to what Sadiq Khan is doing. So, you know, I don't agree with Sadiq Khan in any way, and I don't support what he's doing, but as an example of where things can be effective. And what people fail to realize is that we have the capacity and the capabilities to do exactly the same. And going back to when we talked about the local elections coming up, again, this could be a coalition effect. You work with not only work to identify councillors in your local area who could bring a different mindset and worldview to the local area, but collaborate amongst different areas to form coalitions to gain grassroots power. But beyond that, your example of the taking down the surveillance, to me, that's a political pressure group. You know, and it rises in legitimacy by its membership, by the scope and scale of its voice. And I think that's where civic responsibility, to me, is one of the key avenues now. And it goes full circle back to not only personal responsibility and culture, but role modeling behaviors, leadership.
That's correct. And a lot of people are very passive. And so this is actually can play to your advantage in some cases, because the number of people who want to be on a platform for the local neighborhood typically is not very big. I mean, in this case, I mean, how many people in my area would want to be going in front of the cameras and talking about the needs of the area? I mean, frankly, I can tell you that not a lot of people here would want to step up. Now, that means the field is open to the few people who step up. They're the ones who get the visibility, you know, so it really can play to your advantage, the fact that there is a lot of passivity in the community.
Indeed. David,
I'm not saying that that's like something we want, passivity in order to get a platform, but just given that this is the situation, let's try to harness that situation. And we want a community with more active and public spirited people. But given that that this is a situation where there's a lot of passivity, the fact of the matter is that those who do step up can quite quickly get visibility in a community, very often for the simple reason that there aren't that many people who step up.
Yes, no, David, you're absolutely right. Coming into the kind of closing track, we didn't actually agree how much time we would talk for, but it's obviously getting later. The elements we're talking about here is civic responsibility, people power, personal responsibility. You and I have touched upon, you know, prior to this conversation, that we've seen this huge movement galvanized over the course of the COVID chapter. It may still be minority in terms of the overall majority when we look at the wider population. But nonetheless, we saw a gathering of significant numbers who came together, took a stand, and there is a concern amongst some that we've almost, if we're not careful, going to witness the kind of Occupy movement where it very quickly dissipated, the energy was lost. So I suppose I'd like to close out by, you know, in the context of everything we've discussed, you know, how do we continue to build momentum from here and ensure that, you know, we continue to educate people about the kind of issues that we're facing, but not just to go beyond but education into moving into an active state of action?
Yeah, I'd say that basically Occupy, in order to get beyond the Occupy phenomenon, Occupy essentially didn't know what they want. They knew what they didn't want, but they had some idea of that. But they didn't know what they wanted, or they had so many different wants that they just had no way of converging, and they never really institutionalized in a way that was viable and sustainable. So to institutionalize basically just means, in some ways, I guess you could say, to introduce a certain amount of routine, a certain amount of, say, shared rules, or ways of going about things that are more or less predictable, and to enter into stable relationships with people in which roles are defined. Roles are defined to some extent, not rigidly, but at least, in a kind of a preliminary way, that there are roles in these organizations, and that these organizations become integrated into people's way of life, so that it's a little bit like, I'll take the analogy of religion, because how has religion survived 2000, like how has, say, the Catholic Church survived for 2000 years, right? I mean, that's a question, interesting question, isn't it? I mean, when so many other institutions, secular institutions, are in the dust a long, long time ago, that started 2000 years ago, right? I can think of very few that survived 2000 years. What happened? How did they manage that? I mean, essentially, they were internalized habits, and they were a way of life that was externalized, but also internalized, because there was a social form or a social, let's say, structure of some kind, that was flexible and that was able to adapt to different circumstances. And this helped. And there was, of course, a shared ideal among these people. And of course, from the point of view of a Catholic, I'm Catholic myself. Well, obviously, I do believe this, that there was grace involved, that a divine grace that protected the institution of the church and helped it survive so many scandals and so many, storms. It should have been dead a long time ago from a human point of view, in my opinion. But anyway, that's just a side note. Sticking to the social science aspect, I would say, we can learn something from the way the churches survive over time. I mean, there has to be a certain amount of ritual. There has to be a certain amount of a shared language and narrative that is at least embryonic, and that is kind of distilling, and that is becoming something that the people can believe in. And I mean, just the very fact that there's a way for people to connect with each other and hook into a community of sorts, some sort of community that in which it's not just, I just look at one podcast and then pop on to the next one, but that there's some sense of a connection and loyalty. Loyalty is a word that I think is very important here. What does it mean to be loyal? And, can we make anything sustainable without loyalty? I honestly think no. I don't think that without loyalty, I don't think these things can work. It's the same for universities, schools. Any institution needs loyalty. And if people become too instrumental in their attitude, and it's all, what serves my best interests, or what the bottom line is, if I can maximize my income in any way possible within the law, well, then, of course, I'll just shift around and move around as opportunity, calls. So this is a real difficulty, a challenge. But I think what you're trying to do in Elevate, is essentially, it's to cultivate a sense of community and loyalty in difficult circumstances, really, because in many ways, this is a community that crosses geographic frontiers, and it's not just sort of something completely located in one locale, in one place. So that's difficult. But, I think there can be such a thing as online communities, some kind of online communities, but then people do need embodied communities as well.
Absolutely.
And that's really critical. I know you've done some events that were embodied and that were like, where you have a chat and you have speakers, and it's like for a few days, And unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to any of them. I was in another country and it just didn't fit. I wasn't able to do it. But that's a nice thing to do as well. And I think that's something that can make it very real for people.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lot there. And I think it's actually looking at those foundational building blocks that will give this longevity. And we discussed this on our last community session with the Elevate platform. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a comparable state in many ways to the Occupy movement, namely what we're moving away from. And there's lots of similarities: anti-globalization, anti-corruption, anti-corporatism. You can actually lay them out and see side by side. They're pretty similar. But then how does that translate into specific demands of government in terms of policy change? How does that translate into specific objectives? How does that translate into something to move towards? And I think that forward motion, that forward vision, it's all very powerful to say, okay, well, we know what we're moving away from. What are we moving towards? And I think we actually sometimes overcomplicate that, because when we think about a vision, particularly in the kind of world of technology we live in, we kind of think, we can't think, technology moves so fast. We think, what's the world actually going to look like tomorrow, let alone in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, with the kind of the rise of AI and stuff. But, and I'm reminded of a friend of mine. She'd gone through a breakup. She was all upset. And we sat on the sofa and I said, look, plenty more fish in the sea. At some point, you'll get over this and you'll have the wonderful opportunity to look for a new partner. And I said, having learnt what you've learnt now, what are you looking for in your next partner? And she listed off straight away 5 things that she certainly didn't want. And I was like, okay, so you know what you didn't want, but the question was, what are you looking for? And she said, I don't know. I really don't know. I said, well, let's start by taking those 5 things you said and just literally look at the reverse. Let's flip it on its head and reverse it. And she said, oh, okay, so I don't like that. So what's the opposite of that? It's this. And her eyes lit up and was like, and lo and behold, I'm not taking any credit for what happened next, but she ended up not too distant future with a new partner, and they're married now, 2 children. But it can be that simple. We talked about localization, anti-globalization, localization. We want greater autonomy on a local level. We want to be able to influence the way that we live in the communities in which we operate, live, work, and play. Anti-corporatism. Okay, well, what does that mean? What's the opposite of that? Again, it's not quite as easy to answer, but you get my point. Sometimes if we know what we're moving away from, we overcomplicate what we want to move towards, and sometimes it can be literally the polar opposite of what we're standing against.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, this is very general to say this, but I think the 2 elements of the change at the most general level, one is networking and the other is leadership. And networking here, I don't mean just as in getting people's telephone numbers or something. I mean networking as in creating a genuine network, relationships that can be reiterative, and that where you can enter into cooperation, basically to forge projects with other citizens that have an interest for them, that have a genuine interest for them. And those projects are not forged without leadership. So that's why I say that networking and leadership are the 2 elements that have to come together. And I remember something that Tocqueville says. I'm always quoting Tocqueville because I just think he's such a wonderful theorist of democracy. And he says that in the new democracy, citizens are just little pygmies. They're like tiny little, that's not politically correct what I just said. They're tiny little, what would you say? Very, very small people, let's say, who really can't fend for themselves. They're helpless, faced by these gigantic structures. In the old days, you had your local prince or for better or for worse, who would who would represent you in some ways before the king. And so you weren't just going to be crushed by the king. The aristocrats, noblesse oblige and all of that, were supposed to look out for the interests of their dependents, almost like a family. This is an idealized version of aristocracy, of course, but he basically said that in the modern age, in the democratic age, the aristocrats disappear, the nobles disappear, and lo and behold, it's just little old me in front of the state, and the state can crush me. And of course it can. We saw it during the pandemic. It can crush me. And so what he said was, what do we do in a modern democratic era? He said, we have to create a new aristocracy. And the new aristocracy is associations. Because when we associate with our fellows, we become more powerful. And then that group becomes like a prince that has salience and visibility and can stand up to the state. And so using that kind of imagery, I mean, it's a way of thinking about this, that if you want to defend your interests, whether it be just leisure or whether it be your business interests or your fiscal interests or who knows what, sending your kids to a good school, you know, everyone can think of what their interests are. I mean, and then think, what am I doing about it, right? Like, I want a good school, but there's no good schools in my area. I'm not happy with the schools. Had it occurred to you to maybe start contacting parents and figure out a way to set up a school? Like, is that something you would even consider? And if you wouldn't consider it, like, why not? As an example, right? Because that touches your own children, right? Or leisure, you know, you might say, okay, well, leisure is crap around here. There's nothing to do. Like, you know, there's nothing. You can't do anything around here. I mean, then what? Well, maybe you start thinking about fundraising for a swimming pool, and joining and finding business people who can partner into that. I mean, I'm just giving little examples off the top of my head.
Yes.
But the point is that if your starting point is that the state has to provide everything or whatever, then you're not going to do anything. Of course you're not. You're just going to just mind your own business. That's self-defeating.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm fired up. I'm excited. Yeah. I just get so enthralled with potential. You know, you ignited so many possible angles in the course of this conversation, you know, all coming back to the idea that what we talk about a lot in the Elevate community is personal responsibility, being the change we want to see, cultivating a sense of freedom in our kind of role model behaviors, thinking about how we can become catalysts for change, because to catalyze is to ignite, it's to set something into motion. And, you know, in order to do that, we have to kind of take the mantle, the baton, and say, I will do this. And I've said it a number of times in recent community gatherings where I say that we often ask, what can we do? And it's a very interesting question to ask, what can we do, particularly when we're sat amongst like-minded people. But why aren't people asking, what can I do? What can I do? Because when they say, what can we do, they're assuming that someone else will be starting it often. Someone else will kick it into motion. Someone else will get it going. So it's important to ask, what can we do? Because we're in alliance, we're working together to get stronger. But if every person is waiting for the other person to do something, then we're all sat together feeling good about ourselves because we found people, like-minded people.
Absolutely.
But what's changing?
I know there are going to be people out there who will say that they're not entrepreneurs and they feel like they don't have the imagination, or they just don't feel up to the task of trying to found something new. Okay, let's grant that. Okay, and let's grant that, even though some people underestimate their own ability, and that's very possible, including myself. I think nonetheless, there are, like, another alternative approach is to say, take a good look around you and see which organizations, associations, or groups are doing something that resembles what you want. And then ask, are you going to go in there and pull your weight and help out? Because maybe you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe there's something out there that really is close to what you're looking for. But you could actually empower that group, make it more powerful, make it more effective by bringing your talents into the pool of that group. And so, because it's true, there are sometimes we're surprised if we investigate. We can be pleasantly surprised and discover there's actually something out there that's along these lines already.
Yes.
And, I mean, an example, I mean, I don't know if this is, but I say insurance, health insurance. Personally, I believe that the future of health insurance is going to be, in the future, it's going to be there's going to be more private involvement in the healthcare sector, and that there will be probably a lot of some form of partnerships between governments and private companies will become even more common in the future. That's just the way I see healthcare going. And so when I chose how to insure my own family, I deliberately opted into a private health insurance. I was lucky enough that my university had somewhat discounted prices for the health insurance because of having a university hospital. So we get our health services at the university hospital. But because I believe so much that the future of insurance and health has to be devolved into private initiative and has to be more of a kind of a socially based activity, I felt that my little contribution to that, even if it's a drop in the ocean, was to insure my own family through that kind of insurance scheme, rather than just say, "Oh, I'm just going to use the public health system. That's it." And I'm not trying to be a posh about this and say that it's better to be in a private health system, morally speaking, or something. That would be absurd. But I'm just trying to say that if you have the resources and the ability to advance a private initiative that is not dependent on the state, especially in a society where some of those state resources are going to be depleted over time and are not going to be up to the task, why not, put your investment into private initiatives, whether it be health insurance or education, even if it hurts you a little bit more financially in the short term, in the medium term, because of course it's easier to just get things that are just out of my taxes. It's easier in general. But something inside me said, apart from, because it's not that the health insurance here, the private health insurance is incredibly better, that there's a huge differential in quality between them. It's one of those few cases where actually, in some cases, the public system might be a little bit better. But in general, the difference is not enormous. But just, think about how you spend your money, basically, right? Because you're an economic actor, you're a social actor. Where do you invest your money? How do you avail of services, public services, private services, and so on? Try to think all the way down the line, not just in terms of your political action, but your economic action.
I think it's powerful. I mean, obviously the healthcare conversation would instantly trigger kind of lots of different views on public, private. But it's almost one of those, it's become an axiom in a way that public health should be a provision of the state. And I mean, that's probably a 2-hour episode into that conversation. But I think the premise of what you're saying is important, where you spend your money. And, and even if you think in parallel to the same media systems, are you spending your money on the BBC or are you investing in independent media? Our purchasing power is a way that we can also shift the culture. And it's another rung of power that we can start to build. And your point around not everyone being entrepreneurial, not necessarily having the ideas to start that, I've looked at enough personality theory to understand that there are different profiles, and some people are much better akin at supporting others. And as you were saying, I was just like, I'm going to put a pop-up on the screen saying, if you want to support Elevate, click here, because we've got plenty of goals and plans, but not people and resources. So there are people out, and that's the thing. And I also think, and just to get this point across as well, because I know a lot of people are asking, what can they do to contribute to freedom? And some people are naturally thinkers. They're kind of the thinking mind. Some people are kind of strategic. They you see the two statues of the philosopher and the doer, and this philosopher's kind of still there pondering. The doer is the empty statue. The person's already gone, they're off. But that's an interesting metaphor, because we do have the thinkers who like to analyze, to strategize. Then you've got the kind of feeling group, the group that they're into energy, they're into the way and the values and how things are done. And then you've got the execution, the implementers, and they like to do things fast, they like to build. And it's very generalized into those three categories, but you really need all three categories working in sync. You know, some describe it as kind of like the artist, the entrepreneur, and the manager in a way. You have these three, you know, different, however you want to dress it up. But the reality is every project needs a combination of these things. So if you're not the person yourself who's got the ideas and the creativity to start something, you might be able to support and help implement in a different way. So I think we all have a part to play in terms of creating a free and open society moving forward. And the key is actually to know thyself, you know, to understand your own values, your own beliefs, your own skill set, your own potential, and then start to direct that in a way and in a fashion that can actually contribute to the change you want to see in the world. And therefore you move from passive observer to active participant in change. And the more of us that do that, one by one, step by step, we will move towards a more free and beautiful future. Yeah.
And I think that on a very mundane level, just think about independent media and think about, any social actor that you think is doing a lot of good and that is providing alternative approach to things that is better than some of the mainstream approaches. The question somebody can ask themselves, am I supporting these people? Like if I'm not doing it myself, right, which is fair enough, because we can't all be journalists, we can't all be founders of organizations, we can't all be the public face of organizations. But if I'm not doing it myself, then I can at least ask the question, okay, am I willing to help in some way or contribute in some way or support in some way? So independent media, independent journalists, and here I do have a personal interest involved in here because because I have a Substack and I rely on subscriptions to make it work. But I think that independent journalists basically don't have a steady flow of income coming normally from their boss or something or from some corporate organization. So they depend on crowdfunding of some kind. And this is the whole Substack model, for example, is all about subscriptions. And they're modest subscriptions. They tend to be like €5 a month or something like that, or 50 a year. But if you don't mind me mentioning that, because I think it's something people could take into consideration. And I'll just mention that if they would like to check out my Substack, they can find it. And I try to, most of my ideas or about current affairs and culture tend to end up on my Substack. They can find it at my name, which is davidthunder.substack.com, all together, davidthunder.substack.com. And, they can look at it and decide whether they want to subscribe and be on an email list or get it on an app. But all that support helps. And how does it help journalists? It helps them because it gives them an extra bit of motivation when they feel that support to keep moving and keep going. And because they may not be necessarily getting a fixed salary for what they're doing, and they may want to do it out of the goodness of their heart as well. But I think feeling that support, even if it's a little bit of economic support for what they're doing, it really gives them extra momentum to move forward. Because when you think about it, many journalists are absolutely doing a terrible job and they're being paid for what they're doing. So I think we should think about, well, do I buy a newspaper? Well, then maybe I should also be supporting independent journalists. I've stopped buying newspapers personally. I do look at them online, but I've stopped buying them for the most part, not out of principle, but just because they're not as interesting to me anymore as they used to be.
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I strongly encourage everyone to check out David's freedom blog at davidthunder.substack.com. We'll put the links in the description of the episode and share it with the resources of this episode. And I know financials during a time like this, when we've got cost of living crisis and economic recession pending and all this kind of stuff, it makes some financial decisions difficult. But I like to go for the substitution effect, and I sat down and looked at my direct debits at the beginning of the year, and there's quite a few I was able to cancel. And I made the conscious decision that I was going to invest what was then a surplus created by doing that in as many different organizations or Substacks as I could to replace it. So sometimes it's a replacement effect, and particularly if you're spending money on the Telegraph or some other mainstream media, that's an easy choice, And the good thing is about a lot of these platforms, whether it's Elevate or Substack with your Freedom blog, we've most of us have got an entry level that makes it affordable for most people to get involved. And I know the objection for a lot of people is, well, there's so many people doing so much great work now. What do I choose? And I think you just have to go with what you resonate with most. There's enough in the movement. If everyone played a part in helping to finance the movement, even on a small level, then we wouldn't have to think about the kinds of corporate finance that the kind of big machine relies upon. So crowdfunding is a method of liberation in itself, and there is enough people in this movement to actually support a great deal of those who are heavily active in driving things forward. It's just making those conscious choices and looking for those voices and publications that you resonate most strongly with, and making a decision to support, because we all need it. We need it, and I think most people I spend time with, they want to scale, they want to grow, they want to grow their impact. When we think of scale, it's got this kind of Silicon Valley kind of prognosis. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how do we amplify our impact? How do we grow stronger? And people resources, financial resources, time resources, physical resources, these are all things that we need in abundance in order to drive things forward.
Absolutely. I think I didn't realize this before I got into it, that actually there are costs, there are actual real costs to doing these things, apart from the time, obviously, but there's also, if you want to edit videos properly, you need to get Adobe or one of these, and so on. And these are subscription services. So, other people are subscribing to my blog, which is fantastic. I'm subscribing, meanwhile, to corporate interests of various sorts of corporate, services.
Yep.
In order to be able to keep the show on the road and, keep good quality material going. And, that's like a project in itself that I sort of come to understand that like it's actual cost and it's actual stable cost. There's a budget to it. And that surprised me, I guess. But I realized if you want to keep up your game, you do have to invest a little bit.
You do. And, most of the software that we use, the costs increased by virtue of how many people are using it. So if you've got more viewers, for instance, or you've got more email subscribers, the email costs got out of control. We had to migrate to a different platform just to keep that under control, because it was literally costing us hundreds per month just to send emails. That's a whole different conversation about the cost of freedom. But the point is everyone can play a part in supporting one another, exactly. And I think that's key. Now, David, I could literally talk to you all night, and I think we must come to a close. We're at hour and 44 in. If I had more time to go to the gym and pump myself up, and shave my head, I could be the next Joe Rogan, but I'm not quite there yet. But the length of the episodes are moving towards it. So, brick by brick. But in all seriousness, I think this is a very stimulating conversation with lots of insight about how we can think about things and practical steps we can take. I would obviously like to stay very much in close contact. The conversation around political transformation is something that's dear to my heart. And certainly within Elevate, we want to start moving in that direction and supporting different ideas and exploring different models. And I'd love to involve you in some of that conversation. But this has been wonderful to have you on the show again. For those of you who've watched live with us, thank you so much. If you would like to be part of our live broadcast discussions, we now invite all of our Elevate supporters to join us live to watch the recordings before they go up on the public platform. So if you'd like to do that, go to weareelevate.org. And if you'd like to check out David's blog, I invite you to go to davidthunder.substack.com. And again, both of those resources will be in the description or comments of the video or platform that you're watching these on. So, David, thanks again for your amazing insights. I know it's getting late where you are now, so must sign off. And my family will be thinking,
very much.
My wife.
I enjoyed the conversation.
Where's he gone? As we started, real life goes on.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to everyone who's watching, and see you all again very soon. Please hit the share button if you're watching this on the public platforms. Let's spark a conversation that can result in more people taking action today towards a free and open society.